In Britain's long military history, she's had her share of high points, and equally, she's had her share of low points too. But in December 1899, the British Army was defeated 3 times in 5 days by the Boers in South Africa. 2,800 of Queen Victoria's finest troops were either killed, wounded or captured by a citizen army of irregular farmers from 2 tiny Boer republics. Shocked British press dubbed it Black Week. The 3 disasters in Black Week took place during the Second Anglo Boer War, often simply called the Boer War or the South Africa War. The war pitted the might of the British Empire against 2 tiny Boer republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State. I've done a short video that gives an overview of the Boer War, so I don't want to repeat myself for those of you who've already seen it. But if you want to watch it, then there's a link in the description below, and there's also one appearing on the screen, well, about now. The 1890s were in many respects the high point of the British Empire, which over the previous 20 years had taken a leading role in the scramble for Africa, where European powers had been carving out empires on the continent. At the southern tip of the continent, they'd put themselves in pole position, but there was a handicap to their ambitions to create an English-speaking Southern African Federation. The 2 Boer republics, Afrikaner republics, of Transvaal and Orange Free State. The Boers were descendants from principally Dutch and French Huguenots who had fallen out with their British colonial masters in the 1830s. Many Boers had simply packed their wagons and in an event called the Great Trek had moved inlands away from British control, establishing their own independent republics. Not only did the Boers have no desire to be part of the British Empire, but they were also sitting on the biggest gold reserves in the world, a tempting prize for any British imperialist. And the actions of one such imperialist, Cecil Rhodes, had soured any possible harmony between the Boers and the British. In 1895, he had launched a private invasion of the Transvaal, seeking to overthrow its government. It was called the Jameson Raid. And I've done a talk about that event too. Another link's just appearing right now. The Jameson Raid was an alarm bell to the Boers that their very independence was threatened by British imperial ambitions. With the wealth of their own gold mines, the Boers began to arm themselves. The Germans, who were sympathetic to their plight, not least because their Kaiser saw that sort of any enemy of Britain was a friend of Germany's, supplied the Boers with the very latest Mauser rifles and Krupp's artillery. By 1899, relations had reached a point where the Boers, fearing a British invasion, decided on a preemptive strike of their own, declaring war on the British Empire. The Boer forces swept across the border into the Cape Colony, where they laid siege to the railway town of Mafeking and the diamond-producing capital of the world, Kimberley. To the east, a Boer army under the command of veteran Piet Joubert, a victor over the British at Majuba 20 years beforehand, besieged a 12,000-strong British army at Ladysmith in the colony of Natal. Taken off guard, the British finally sprang into action. A full army corps, nearly 50,000 soldiers strong, was dispatched to South Africa under the experienced General Buller. From Crediton in Devon, Buller had entered the army back in 1858 and he'd earned his reputation as a fighting soldier, winning the Victoria Cross during the Zulu War. Despite a career that had seen action in Egypt, Sudan, Ghana, China, as well as the Zulu War, he'd spent the last 10 years in various desk jobs back in England. With a huge walrus moustache, a ruddy face, a large waistline, he was hugely popular with his men. But some people might have argued that he was no longer as sharp as he used to be. Now, once more marching to the sound of gunfire, the 60-year-old set sail from Southampton and disembarked at Cape Town on the last day of October 1899. He was met by the news that the army in Ladysmith under General White had on the previous day met with 2 reverses against the Boers. In the 2 engagements at Lombard's Kop and Nicholson's Neck, White had lost nearly 1,300 men, mainly captured, on what was dubbed Mournful Monday. The only positive for Buller was that the elderly senior Boer commanders seemed happy to be conducting sieges rather than charging for the coast, which was the desire of some of their younger commanders. If they'd followed the ambitions of those young gun commanders like Louis Botha, Jan Smuts, Christian de Wet, the Boers might have denied the British disembarkment ports, and the Cape Afrikaners might have then risen in revolt with them. As it was, Buller was able to land his army in Cape Town and plan his next step. His preference was to use his whole force to march from the Cape to capture the Boer capitals of Bloemfontein and then on to the other capital at Pretoria. But with the reversal of White's latest endeavours on Mournful Monday, as well as the continuing sieges of Kimberley and to a lesser extent Mafeking, Buller felt obliged to change his plan and divide his forces to meet the threats presented by the Boers on three fronts. Lieutenant General Methuen was to lead a force of nearly 20,000 strong to relieve Kimberley. General Gatacre was to lead a much smaller force which would ensure there was no rising of local Afrikaners in the Cape Midlands, sort of to the south of the Orange Free State. And Buller himself would personally oversee the relief of Ladysmith. The first disaster in Black Week was to befall General Gatacre's force in the Cape Midlands on the 10th of December 1899 at the Battle of Stormberg. Advancing from their disembarkment point at East London, Gatacre heard that a Boer force under General Olivier, numbering about 2,000 men, had taken the railway town of Stormberg, just inside the Cape Colony. General William Gatacre had joined the army in 1862, when gentlemen still purchased their commissions. He was a veteran of the Victorian Empire's wars in Burma, the northwest frontier in India, Chitral, and the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan just the previous year, which had been a high point in his career. He was a man of action who prided himself on the fitness of his troops to such an extent that they, with classic British humour, turned Gatacre's surname into the nickname Backacre. His plan was to move a force of nearly 3,000 men up to the nearest railway point to Stormberg, and then using local guides from the Cape Mounted Police, he would march the last 8 miles through the night to surprise the Boers with a dawn attack. His force consisted of the 2nd Battalion, the Northumberland Fusiliers, the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Irish Rifles, the 74th and 77th Battalions of the Royal Artillery, and 250 local mounted infantry, the Cape Mounted Rifles. This, in theory, was more than enough to successfully complete their mission. But not for the first time, and not for the last time, theory and reality diverged in the Boer War. First off, his men were not battle-hardened. In fact, since its formation in 1881, the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Irish Rifles had never seen active service. Nor had, apart from the local volunteers, any of them any experience of Africa, its conditions, its landscape, or indeed of the Boers. The railway journey to the start point had been painfully slow. A lack of locomotives meant that many of the troops had been cooped up, either waiting for transportation or in the actual wagons in the baking sun. Moreover, this slow build-up had been noticed by the Boer scouts and also, of course, by local Afrikaner sympathisers who were informing the Boers of what was going on. Nevertheless, with his troops finally marshalled, on the night of the 9th of December, the British moved forward into the dark of the African night to seize a hill or kopje near Stormberg. With this height advantage, they would then sweep the Boers from the low-lying areas beneath them and retake the railway town. The local guides from the Cape Mounted Police under a Sergeant Morgan turned out not to be as reliable as expected, and they managed to actually miss several landmarks and turning points during the dark African night. As dawn broke, they found themselves near the intended hill, but in the wrong position, and instead of an easy incline, they had a steep climb to get to the top. As dawn broke, Boer sentries fired warning shots to awaken their comrades, and the British force rushed forward towards the hill to try and take the hill. The steep sides of the hill made the going hard, and in many places they were pinned down. In other places, the sides were so sheer they just could not climb them. All the while, they were being subjected to a growing and highly accurate rifle fire from the Boers on the summit, many of whom had been shooting since they were young boys on their farms. Despite the difficult climb and the shots coming down from the Boers, the men of the Northumberland Fusiliers and the Royal Irish Rifles started to inch themselves up that hillside. Unfortunately, it was at this moment that the British artillery opened up, but with the sun in their eyes, they were struggling to clearly identify exactly who was who on the mountainside, and their shells started to fall on their hapless comrades. Lieutenant Colonel Eager, commanding the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles, gathered his senior officers for a conference. Should they, despite their losses and the friendly fire they were having, try and storm the ridge, or should they retreat? No decision was taken because at that moment a British shell exploded overhead, wounding all 4 senior officers. Eager himself was to die of his wounds. Finally, with more and more Boer reinforcements appearing on the summit of the hill, the commander of the Northumberland Fusiliers ordered his men down the mountain. Gatacre concurred and ordered a general retreat back to the point where the men had disembarked from their trains the night before. Assembling his men at the railway point, it was only when a roll call was taken, just after midday, that Gatacre realised that his message to withdraw had not reached all his men, and that nearly 600 had been left surrounded by the Boers on the hillside. Not surprisingly, those men, having found themselves effectively abandoned by their comrades and facing the Boer sharpshooters, had chosen to surrender. Along with 600 prisoners, Gatacre had also lost 130 men killed and wounded from his force of 3,000. His reputation, high after the Battle of Omdurman just 1 year before, was in tatters. And a few months later, he would be transferred back to Britain, where he would retire in 1904. The Battle of Stormberg was a shambles, it was an embarrassment, and it was a complete military disaster. The only saving grace was the Boers didn't press home their advantage and they stayed stuck exactly where they were. But there was much worse to come that week for the British Army, in what the British press were to dub Black Week. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that brief story from military history. Watch out for my next video from Black Week. It's the Battle of Magersfontein, another British defeat. It's coming very soon.